The lake was still, the kind of stillness that makes sound carry for miles. Dawn painted the water in bands of silver and pale gold, and Garrett Morrison stood at the edge of his dock, coffee steaming in his hands, breathing in the sharp scent of cedar and cold air. For the first time in weeks, it felt almost peaceful until the crunch of tires on gravel shattered it. A black SUV rolled up to his driveway like it owned the place. Out stepped Brenda Thornfield, Millbrook Lake Estates HOA president, moving with the brisk confidence of a woman who had never once doubted she was the smartest person in the room. Her heels clicked like gunshots on the dock boards as she approached. "Mr. Morrison," she called out, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. "You've got 48 hours to remove this eyesore." Garrett took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the bitter heat settle on his tongue. He didn't answer right away. He wanted to remember this moment, wanted to fix the image of her standing there, framed by the sunrise, already certain she'd won. "This dock," she continued, tapping the planks with her heel, "violates community standards. If it's not gone by Thursday, we'll pursue legal action. Daily fines. Yeah, whatever it takes." She was talking about lumber and screws. He was thinking about Sarah. The dock was more than a project, it was a promise. 2 years earlier, when the doctors told them there were no more options, Sarah had held his hand and whispered, "Build it anyway. Don't let the lake beat you." She'd been gone 18 months, and every board Garrett shaped, every brass bolt he drove flush into the cedar, felt like a conversation with her. He forced his voice steady. "You're sure about that?" Brenda smiled with the kind of professional sympathy realtors use when explaining closing costs. "I'm afraid so. Millbrook Lake Estates has rules for a reason. Uniformity protects property values. I suggest you hire my husband's company. We'll have it rebuilt to spec in no time." Garrett set down his mug on the rail. "Maybe check the property lines first," he said quietly. "Things aren't always what they look like." But Brenda wasn't listening. She was already pivoting back to her SUV, heels spiking little dents into the wood she claimed to hate. She waved a perfumed hand without turning around. 48 hours, Mr. Morrison. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." When the vehicle disappeared up the road, Garrett sank onto the bench at the end of the dock. The boards were cool under his palms. Sarah would have laughed. "Bullies pick on engineers and regret it later," she used to say. But right now, the fight felt hollow. He wasn't angry yet, just tired. Behind him, the pines stirred as if they sensed a storm brewing. He looked at the lake, smooth, endless, reflecting the sky, and something in the back of his mind shifted. He'd spent 30 years designing bridges, dams, and water systems, building things that lasted. He knew land surveys, deeds, permits like most people knew their own faces. If Brenda thought she could scare him with a clipboard, she was about to learn the difference between a retired widower and a man who'd spent his life making governments listen to his calculations. The coffee had gone cold. Garrett stood, boots thudding softly on the cedar planks, and walked toward the house. He didn't need to argue with Brenda. Not yet. First, he needed to make a call to the county records office. Somewhere in a dusty archive, under yellowing pages no one had read in decades, was a secret his great-uncle Theodore had left behind, a secret Garrett barely remembered, one that might turn Brenda's little power play into the worst mistake of her life. The sun broke fully over the horizon as he stepped inside, spilling gold light across the framed photo of Sarah on the kitchen counter. She was smiling the way she always did when he over-engineered some simple household project just to prove it could be done better. "This one's for you, Sarah," Garrett murmured, reaching for his phone. "Let's see what the Thornfields are really standing on." Garrett spent the afternoon hunched over his kitchen table, spreading out old files like a man assembling a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the sharp tang of cedar dust still clinging to his sleeves. He had called the county records office, and Dolores Martinez, the clerk who had been there longer than most of the building's paint, promised to dig up everything with a Morrison name on it. When evening came, the phone rang. Dolores' voice was warm, like a grandmother sharing gossip that mattered. "Garrett, honey, you got to come down here yourself," she said. "I've got some papers that don't belong in a filing cabinet. They belong in a safe." By the time Garrett hung up, the sky outside was bleeding into deep indigo, and a single thought pulsed behind his eyes. Sarah wouldn't know what to do. She always knew. The next morning, Brenda Thornfield doubled down. A violation notice was duct-taped to his front door in bold red letters, flapping in the spring breeze like a warning flag. The fine, $500 per day, effective immediately. Underneath her signature, she'd written a note in elegant cursive. "We can resolve this amicably if you reconsider my husband's services." Garrett crumpled the notice in his fist, not out of rage, but to keep his hands from shaking. This wasn't about money. It was about the principle of someone thinking they could trample over the last thing that tied him to Sarah. At the mailbox, his neighbor Jake, bathrobe, uncombed hair, steaming mug in hand, looked at the notice and whistled. She really went straight for the jugular. Jake said, "You gonna cave?" Garrett shook his head. "Not in this lifetime." "Good," Jake grinned. "Need me to run interference? I still got that megaphone from the 4th of July parade." Garrett smiled despite himself. Jake meant well, but this wasn't a battle to fight with noise. It needed precision. Later that day, Garrett drove to the county office, the gravel crunching under his tires like distant thunder. Inside, Dolores met him with a stack of folders so thick she needed both hands to carry them. "Your great-uncle Theodore was a clever man," she said, leading Garrett to a quiet corner table. "These aren't just land deeds. This is, well, I'll let you read it." Garrett flipped through yellowed pages covered in neat typewriter print and curling signatures. Words like riparian rights, perpetual water management authority, and exclusive control jumped out at him. He skimmed diagrams of creeks, tributaries, and a dam system built before most of Millbrook Lake's homeowners were born. "This can't be right," Garrett murmured. "You're saying?" "I'm saying," Dolores interrupted with a sly smile, "that long before there was an HOA, your family didn't just own this dock site. They owned everything what it touched." Garrett sat back, stunned. His engineering brain clicked into high gear, assembling timelines, legal implications, and practical power faster than he could breathe. The Thornfields didn't have a legal leg to stand on. They weren't even in the same building. "Dolores, I need copies. Certified ones." "I'll do you one better," she said, handing him freshly stamped duplicates. And Garrett, her eyes twinkled behind thick glasses. "Don't let that woman push you. You've got the kind of leverage that makes lawyers sweat." That night, Garrett walked down to the dock, folder under his arm, and sat at the edge where Sarah's memorial plaque would one day rest. The lake was quiet, moonlight rippling across the surface like liquid glass. "This fight isn't just about you and me anymore," he whispered. "It's about making sure no one else gets bullied by people like her." He thought about Brenda's polished smile, about Rick Thornfield's oversized pickup and the faint smell of diesel every time they drove past. He thought about the arrogance of people who believed rules were tools for power instead of protection. The wind shifted, cool and sharp, carrying the faint creak of dockboards as if Sarah herself had walked out to sit beside him. Garrett wasn't a man prone to anger, but something deeper than anger settled in his chest that night. Resolve. Tomorrow, Brenda would make her next move. And tomorrow, Garrett Morrison would stop playing defense. 2 days later, Garrett woke to the sound of splintering wood. It was sharp, violent wrong. He was halfway down the stairs before his brain caught up to what his ears already knew. Something was happening to the dock. By the time he threw open the door, Jake was running up the drive in slippers, waving his arms like a man on fire. "Garrett, you got to see this." Down at the waterline, the corner of the cedar dock sagged at an ugly angle, boards jutting like broken teeth. 40 yards out, a speedboat idled, its engine puttering with suspicious innocence. At the helm stood Rick Thornfield, one hand raised in mock apology. "Throttle stuck," Rick shouted over the water. "Accident. I'll help you fix it." Garrett didn't move. His bare feet sank into the cold mud as he stared at the damage. The exact spot where Sarah's plaque was supposed to go, ripped apart like an insult. In 30 years of engineering, Garrett had learned to see patterns in chaos. Bridges failed for a reason. Waterways shifted for a reason. And engines didn't accidentally drive straight into memorial corners unless someone wanted them to. Rick waved again, grinning now. No hard feelings. Then the boat spun lazily away, leaving a trail of diesel fumes in its wake. Jake swore under his breath. You gonna let that slide? Garrett crouched beside the wreckage, running his fingers over fresh gouges, smelling the raw, chemical bite of sabotage. His pulse slowed. His hand stopped shaking. Something inside him, something that had been patient, reasonable, grieving, went perfectly still. No, Garrett said quietly. Not this time. That afternoon, while Rick and Brenda congratulated themselves somewhere, Garrett set his own plan in motion. He drove to a marine repair shop 2 towns over, called in an old favor with a mechanic named Tom Rodriguez, and ordered a full analysis of whatever was left of Rick's throttle system. Then he called Detective Sarah Collins at County Water Patrol, a woman who knew Garrett's voice from years of infrastructure inspections. Garrett, she said, haven't heard from you since you retired. What's going on? Hypothetically, Garrett replied, voice flat. What happens if someone deliberately damages flood control property? A pause. Depends on intent. But if you can prove it, criminal mischief at minimum. Sabotage if it affects safety. Good, Garrett said, because I have footage, a damaged dock, and a neighbor dumb enough to think I don't document everything. That evening, Garrett rebuilt the broken corner by hand under a fading orange sky. His tools moved with methodical precision, the way they had when he built bridges across rushing rivers or reinforced levees against spring floods. But his thoughts weren't calm. He could almost hear Sarah teasing him. You're not just fixing planks, you're sharpening your sword. By the time the stars appeared, the dock stood straight again, stronger than before. Garrett wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the folder of certified documents on the workbench. The weight of Theodore Morrison's legacy pressed on him, not as a privilege, but as responsibility. This fight wasn't about a dock anymore. Brenda's arrogance had crossed a line, and Rick's sabotage had burned the bridge back. The next morning, Brenda made her boldest move yet, an emergency HOA meeting at the community center. Professionally printed flyers littered the mailboxes, accusing Garrett of fabricated water rights and endangering property values. When Garrett walked into the fluorescent-lit room, the air hummed with tension and burnt coffee. Brenda stood at the front, clicking through slides comparing Garrett's dock to decaying structures from other lakes. Rick lurked by the wall, arms crossed like a hired enforcer. This man is using grief as a weapon, Brenda declared, her voice sharp. He's defrauding this community with fake documents and refusing to comply with standards designed to protect us all. The neighbors shifted uneasily. A few muttered. A few stared at Garrett with wary curiosity. Garrett let her talk. Let her dig the hole. Then, when she finally gestured in his direction with a theatrical flourish, he rose slowly and opened his folder. Certified county records gleamed under the harsh lights. Mrs. Thornfield, Garrett said calmly, voice carrying to the back row, before you accuse me of fraud again, you might want to check who actually owns this water. He laid the first document on the table. The room went silent except for the hum of the projector. This isn't just my dock, Garrett continued, meeting Brenda's eyes without blinking. My family's water rights cover this entire lake, and every tributary feeding it. That means your so-called rules don't apply here. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Even Rick's smirk faltered. Brenda's smile hardened, brittle as glass. That's ridiculous. Outdated paperwork doesn't override community governance. From the back row, Margaret Morgan, retired real estate attorney, cleared her throat. Actually, Mrs. Thornfield, she said evenly, riparian rights usually predate HOA covenants, and they're very hard to challenge. The room erupted in whispers. Garrett just stood there, calm, folder still open. The turning point had come. This wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about control, and Brenda had just realized she didn't have any. The morning after Garrett's quiet bombshell at the HOA meeting, a certified letter arrived by courier. Not the polite kind, but the kind thick enough to stop a bullet. Sterling and Associates, one of those glossy downtown law firms where a phone call costs more than a used car. The letter accused Garrett of systematic document fabrication, fraudulent claims of riparian authority, and, his personal favorite, exploiting grief-induced psychological instability to circumvent legitimate governance. He had 72 hours to remove his dock, pay $47,000 in fines, and issue a public apology or face federal fraud charges. Garrett read the letter 3 times, then set it down on the table beside Sarah's photo. Her smile seemed to say what she always said: "You're too stubborn to let them win." That evening, Jake came by, pounding on the door with the urgency of a man who'd just discovered gossip worth more than gold. "Garrett, you seeing this?" He held out his phone. Brenda's face filled the screen, a YouTube video shot in her immaculate kitchen with studio lighting. "Fellow residents," she declared in a voice dripping with artificial sincerity, "we face an unprecedented threat. One man is exploiting personal tragedy to steal community assets. He is unstable, dangerous, and willing to destroy our property values for his own gain." Jake scrolled. Facebook groups lit up like Christmas. "She's calling you delusional. Even claims you bribed county officials." Garrett closed his eyes, letting the anger settle deep in his chest. "Let her talk," he said finally. Every word digs her hole deeper. The next day, his rebuilt dock became a war zone again. Not from Rick's boat this time, but from official-looking strangers with cameras and clipboards. State environmental inspectors, county safety officers, even a man from the Army Corps of Engineers. They all left shaking their heads, confused. Garrett's dock and Theodore Morrison's water system passed every test with flying colors. But Brenda filed so many emergency complaints, the lake looked like a government convention. Late that night, Garrett sat alone on the dock, folder of legal documents beside him, staring at the moonlit ripples. For the first time, doubt crept in. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a politician. He was just a widower who built a dock for his wife, now standing against a woman with money, lawyers, and no shame. Sarah's voice whispered in memory, "When bullies pick on engineers, they regret it later." But what if he miscalculated? What if this fight consumed not just his peace, but the legacy Sarah wanted him to protect? The next morning brought fresh fury and clarity. Rick Thornfield, still under investigation for sabotaging the dock, had started a neighborhood safety patrol, parking his truck across Garrett's driveway to monitor suspicious activity. His hired buddies took photos every time Garrett left the house. Garrett walked up to Rick's window, calm as a man buying coffee. "Morning," Garrett said. Rick smirked. "Just keeping the neighborhood safe. Don't want any crazy engineers doing something stupid." Garrett leaned in, voice low. "You might want to move your truck. County deputies are on their way with harassment papers." Rick's smirk twitched. For the first time, Garrett saw a crack in the armor. That night, Garrett's kitchen turned into mission control. Margaret Morgan spread legal pads across the table like a general mapping a battlefield. Patricia Valdez, the water rights attorney, arrived with a briefcase full of filings. Dr. Lisa Morgan, an environmental engineer, reviewed data on Theodore's dam system with the calm precision of someone grading a perfect exam. "This isn't just about Brenda," Patricia said, flipping through Garrett's certified records. "This HOA has been collecting fees illegally for years. We can dismantle their entire foundation in one public hearing." Garrett rubbed his eyes. "I didn't want a war. I just wanted to keep Sarah's promise." Margaret's voice softened. "Then fight it smart. You're not just protecting a dock. You're protecting an entire watershed. This is bigger than you now." Jake, pouring coffee strong enough to wake the dead, grinned. "And when Brenda realizes she's been outmaneuvered by actual law, that meltdown's going to be glorious." Garrett didn't smile. Not yet. He looked out the window at the dark water, thinking about Sarah, about legacy, about responsibility. The weight of what he held, control of the entire lake system, pressed on him like a silent oath. If he failed, Brenda wouldn't just ruin his dock. She'd poison the whole community. And if he won, he'd have to prove he deserved the power Theodore left behind. The town council chamber was packed wall to wall, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee and tension. Local news cameras lined the back wall, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. Garrett walked in alone, folder under his arm, feeling the weight of 3 generations pressing on his shoulders. Brenda Thornfield was already at the podium, dressed like she was running for governor, sharp suit, flawless makeup, voice tuned to righteous outrage. Behind her, Rick loitered with arms crossed, flanked by a nervous-looking lawyer who kept glancing toward the exits. "Council members," Brenda declared, "this man is fabricating century-old documents to claim control over our lake. He's manipulating government agencies, destroying property values, and harassing our community. He even staged the so-called sabotage of his dock to frame my husband." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Garrett felt the anger rise in his chest, but he kept his face still, his engineer's calm masking the slow boil underneath. Council Chairman Robert Hayes rapped his gavel. "Mr. Morrison, you'll have a chance to respond." Garrett didn't move. Not yet. He let Brenda burn herself out, slide after slide of doctored photos and wild accusations. Even a diagram implying Garrett had hacked the county record system. Each claim landed softer than the last, until even her supporters shifted uneasily in their seats. When she finally paused for breath, Hayes turned to Garrett. "Mr. Morrison?" Garrett rose, the room falling into a hush. He walked to the podium without theatrics, opened his folder, and laid out 3 certified documents like pieces of evidence in a criminal trial. "These are the original water management agreements signed in 1923, he said evenly, voice steady but carrying to every corner. "They grant my family, not any HOA, perpetual control over Millbrook Lake and every tributary that feeds it. These have been verified by county, state, and federal records. For 90 years, the county has paid water management fees into my family's trust." Gasps filled the room. Cameras clicked like distant thunder. Garrett turned a page. "This," he continued, "is a security report from County Water Patrol documenting deliberate sabotage to my dock. The mechanical analysis shows tampered throttle controls on Mr. Thornfield's boat." Rick's smirk vanished. The lawyer at his side whispered urgently, face draining to ash. "And this," Garrett said, placing the final document on the podium, "is an official letter from the State Environmental Agency. It confirms that my inherited flood control system has protected 3 townships from millions in damage, and that Mrs. Thornfield filed 14 false emergency complaints in 1 month." A low, angry growl moved through the room, not at Garrett but at Brenda. From the back, Margaret Morgan stood. "As a retired real estate attorney, I can confirm that riparian rights predate and override HOA covenants. Millbrook Lake Estates has been collecting fees illegally for 15 years. Councilman Hayes leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Mrs. Thornfield, do you have any evidence to refute these certified documents?" Brenda opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her perfect smile trembled like glass about to shatter. At that exact moment, the doors at the back swung open. Detective Sarah Collins stepped in, flanked by 2 deputies. "Mr. Thornfield," she called, voice crisp as breaking ice. "You're under arrest for destruction of protected property and attempted sabotage of critical infrastructure." The crowd erupted. Someone shouted, "About time," as Rick stiffened, jaw tight, wrists snapped into handcuffs. Brenda whirled on Garrett, eyes blazing. "You think this ends with you?" she hissed. "I'll bury you in court." Garrett met her gaze with something colder than anger. "No," he said softly. "You buried yourself." Hayes' gavel cracked like a gunshot. "This council recognizes Mr. Morrison's water rights in full. Effective immediately, Millbrook Lake Estates HOA is stripped of all authority over waterfront property. A state investigation into fraudulent fee collection will begin at once." Reporters surged forward, questions flying like arrows. But Garrett didn't stay to answer. He gathered his folder, walked past Brenda's stunned face, and stepped into the cool night air. Outside, the lake shimmered under street lamps, quiet and unbothered. For the first time since Sarah's death, Garrett felt something more than grief, more than anger. He felt peace. The fight was over, and the water was his to protect. Decision was made. The next meeting wouldn't be a defense. It would be a reckoning. 6 months later, the lake looked different, not because the water had changed, but because the people had. Brenda Thornfield's mansion sat empty, the for sale sign leaning crooked in the wind. Rick was serving an 18-month federal sentence, learning that sabotage looks less clever in an orange jumpsuit. The HOA that once ruled by clipboard had dissolved, replaced by a new council led by Margaret Morgan, who believed neighbors were meant to be partners, not prisoners. Garrett never gloated. He didn't need to. The victory wasn't in Brenda's downfall. It was in what came after. On a clear autumn morning, Garrett stood at the end of the rebuilt dock, running his hand over the smooth brass plaque newly set into the cedar rail. The Sarah Morrison Memorial Dock and Learning Center. The words gleamed in the early light, as fresh and certain as the promise he had kept. Children's laughter floated across the water. A class from elementary school was touring the shoreline, guided by volunteers from the newly formed Millbrook Watershed Trust. The trust had been Garrett's idea, built from his great-uncle Theodore's long-forgotten fund, $847,000, now matched by federal grants, to repair and modernize the dam system. What began as a private battle had turned into a community project. Monitoring stations tracked water quality in real time. Wildlife habitats flourished along restored banks. Property values rose, not because of uniform docks, but because people finally understood what they lived beside, a living system, cared for, respected, shared. Garrett smiled as one little boy crouched on the pier, peering at the minnows darting in clear water. Sarah would have loved this. Not the victory, but the transformation. Build it anyway, she had whispered in her last good week. He had, and now the lake carried her name in spirit, if not in writing. That evening, Garrett hosted a small gathering in his kitchen. Margaret brought a bottle of wine. Jake brought his unfiltered jokes, and Dolores from the county records office brought a pie she'd baked to celebrate finally catching the clipboard queen. Even Patricia Valdez, his formidable water rights attorney, cracked a rare smile over dinner. You realize, Margaret said, sipping her wine, you didn't just win a property dispute. You became the steward of half the county's water supply. Garrett laughed softly. All I wanted was to drink my coffee in peace. Patricia leaned forward, eyes serious. And you'll get that peace. But don't forget, rights this powerful come with responsibility. You've proven you can handle it. Now, keep proving it. Garrett nodded. He'd already decided. The water would never become a weapon, only a resource. Theodore had built it to protect people, and Garrett would do the same. Later, when the guests left and the house grew quiet again, Garrett walked back down to the dock. The night air was cool and sharp, the lake glassy under a thin slice of moon. He sat on the bench where Sarah's nameplate shone in the starlight. You were right, he murmured into the darkness. About the bullies, about the promise, about everything. Somewhere out on the water, a loon called, that lonely, rising note that had comforted him through sleepless nights. Only now it didn't sound lonely. It sounded alive. The lights of Millbrook shimmered along the shore, no longer the homes of strangers, but of neighbors. Children would learn here. The dam would stand stronger. The lake would outlive them all. Garrett stood, hands resting on the cedar rail. For the first time since Sarah's death, he didn't feel like a man holding on to the past. He felt like a man building something for the future. The water whispered against the pilings, soft and steady, as if the lake itself were answering her promise. Build it anyway. And he had.